Hi, everyone. This is Jessica from CorpU, and I'd like to welcome you to this month's Smarter Growth Series, Building an Organization That Learns. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Should you have any issues or questions during the broadcast, please type a question into the question box, and I will assist you. All of our webinars are recorded and added to our website, so you will be able to access this webinar as well as all of our past Smarter Growth series on www.corpu.com/events. And we want to make sure that you ask questions. This is an interactive session, so please be sure to type questions in the questions if you have questions for either Alan or Pepe, and we will get to you. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to CorpU's founder and CEO, Alan Todd.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited about today's topic because organizational learning is my entire professional purpose and passion. And today's guest speaker, Pepe Auricio, from IESE in Barcelona, Spain. He's a learning leader. He drives innovation at ESA. They've been ranked #1 by the Financial Times over and over and over again in custom executive education. So when it comes to developing global solutions and thinking about the future of how organizations learn, Pepe is a colleague. We've had a relationship for a long time, and he and I are both alum of the Penn CLO program. So I'm super excited to have Pepe with us today. Pepe, if you're there, good afternoon to you.
Yes, good afternoon, Alan, and to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Pepe's joining us from Barcelona today, so 5 p.m. your time. We are at 11 a.m. on the East Coast. So to sort of frame today, everything we think about is helping organizations become learning organizations, where people learn how to win together in the marketplace and collective aspiration is set free. That's kind of the key. And we believe this is urgent right now because the learning curves in every industry continue to steepen. And so the rate at which an organization learns becomes the most sustainable source of competitive advantage. And we know that requires changing culture, mindsets, and skills, and building capabilities and getting people to shared visions. That's how organizations start to shape that learning curve and drive that learning curve for others to follow. But you've got to change that rate of learning. And a lot of what we do is built upon standing on the shoulders of giants. Back in 1991, almost 30 years ago, Peter Senge wrote a book that lit the management world on fire, the art and practice of the learning organization, the fifth discipline. And in that, he went on a number of different things, but the one that is a thread that leads through all learning organizations, and this hasn't changed from 2,000 years ago, it hasn't changed from 30 years ago, it hasn't changed today, and I would submit it's going to change and be even more important in the future, and it's the simple art, the human art of dialogue, and dialogue coming from its Latin roots, dialogos, which translates roughly into shared meaning flowing through a group. But it's through dialogue that we move from vision to shared vision. So whether you're leading a team and you're trying to get to a shared vision about where are we going next, or whether you're with a group of people trying to get to the root cause of a problem, I would suggest that we can learn from dialogue, dating all the way back to Socrates and the Socratic method and Socratic dialogue, but that is the pathway there. And we're in a new world now where there's a learning organization renaissance driven by technology and bandwidth and big data that we now have access to use our supercomputer smartphones to engage in structured dialogue and analytics to help make sense of the extent to which we're achieving a shared vision, or we're positive in our sentiment, or leaning in as we're developing new solutions or solving problems. So now is a great time to become a learning organization, but lo and behold, there are two big things that stand in the way of this magic learning organization, the sustainable competitive advantage that can't be beat and you outlearn the competition. And they're real simple. The first is organization-wide. Organizations are built for predictability and reliability and the eradication of variance. Well, that's the opposite of learning. And if we go to individuals, the same is true. We are built to protect ourselves, and our egos have to be validated. So it's very difficult to subordinate your ego to the group to engage in real dialogue. And the other thing we all tend to do is we have a set of mental models, our views of the world, and we bring those into meetings. And so whether we're protecting our ego or sharing our existing views of the world, these are huge barriers. And the way you start thinking about breaking them down is by having a set of leaders that think about creating the conditions and shaping the environment for everyone to learn. And I'll just stand on the shoulders of two more luminaries. So Kurt Lewin with Behavior as a Function of the Person and the Environment. What it says in Kurt Lewin's research, and this goes back to the sort of early and mid 20th century, is basically you can send them off to training, but if they come back and the environment doesn't change, they're going to go right back to the way they were. So both behavior change is a function of changing the person, maybe developing new mindsets, new behaviors, but the environment must come with it. And finally, with Maslow, so if they're crippled by fear, they don't feel safe enough to dare, you don't get learning. So with that as our backdrop, I'm super excited to turn it over to Pepe. Pepe, if you can help us walk through building an organization that learns. I know you teach this. I know you teach it in Exec Ed, and you talk about it, and you post on LinkedIn, and you're out in the market, and you speak at conferences all over the world. So we're excited to hear your thoughts on the topic today. So with that, over to you.
So first of all, Alan, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure. Secondly, it's very humbling, given your knowledge and that of the audience, to actually present any ideas whatsoever and presume they're going to be of value. So I'll state up front that most probably what I'll say will not be new to you. As a academic, or at least surrounded by academics, at best I can provide you with a little bit of a frame in which to order some of the things that are happening around us. And so that's what I hope to do in the next minutes, and then engage with you all in a conversation on if you believe some of this is happening, and if so, what you're doing about it. So for those of you that have a busy day and want to cut out now, I'm going to tell you already what the solution is, in the sense of I will tell you now what we'll discuss in greater detail over the next few minutes. And it really has to do with three things. So building an organization that learn, for me, is understanding a little bit the why, the what, and the how. In what sense? First of all, the why in terms of why is learning demanding a new role today? And I will argue that learning is today a foundation for sustainability, for competitive sustainability, as opposed to simply an individual prerogative. Secondly, if that's the case, I will argue the what, our view of learning as a practice needs to change. We need to go beyond learning that happens at a moment in time in a particular place and is facilitated, to learning that we defined as Omni learning. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. The third aspect, how, is perhaps the most difficult. How do we create organizations that are magnets for omni learners, or what others are starting to refer to as lifelong learners, right? How do we create an organization that actually facilitates, enables the learning initiative of each individual? And for that, there's no blueprint. So I will not be able to provide you with a blueprint. What we will do is observe one company that I think is amongst a group that has some answers, and that is Microsoft. Observe what it's doing and try to make some sense out of that. All right, so that's the agenda, the why, the what, and the how. And of course, we'll start from the top, the why, and this idea of learning as a foundation for agility and sustainable performance. So in 2003, a renowned futurist, Ray Kurzweil, stated that the 21st century will be equivalent to 20,000 years of progress. Now, this is a nice, catchy phrase, but it actually holds something that I think is quite true, which is related to the nature of change in our current business world, right? It's not that change itself is new, but it's the speed and constant nature of change that is new. And fundamentally, we associate this with a phenomenon that has come to be known as digitalization, right? Digitalization itself, though, often is associated in our boardrooms to particular technologies. We talk about mobile, we talk about social, we talk about AI, and we ask ourselves, do we have a mobile strategy? Do we have an AI strategy? Do we have a social strategy, right? The real question I think we should be asking is, what is the impact of digitalization on organizations and organizational change? What is the underlying impact that we need to be aware of and do something about? And I think an answer can be found in a concept that is pretty old and probably familiar to you, which is that of the S-curve. Now, you remember the S-curve from research around diffusion of innovation, right? And if you recall, the theory goes, innovation is adopted first by a group referred to as the early adopters, and then subsequently by the majority, and finally the laggards. This same concept, the S-curve, we can use to describe how industries and organizations evolve. And so let me explain how that is so. If you think of an industry, if you think of an organization, right, the evolution of that begins with what we call the startup phase. If some of you have been in that phase, you'll know what it means. And startup is all about creating a new offering, right? Capabilities that are essential are things like outside the box thinking, creativity, flexibility, right? They're top of mind during the startup phase. Once the product is on the market, once the new offering stabilizes and finds buyers, we move to what is called the scale-up phase, right? The firm, the industry progresses to a phase in which basically bringing that product to market as quickly as possible is what is essential. Right? And so here, different capabilities come into play, mostly operational efficiency, right? Operational efficiency is essentially the primary concern of an organization in the scale-up phase. And finally, we go on to the third phase, the sort of tombstone phase, or otherwise called maturity, right? And in this phase, there's at this point other offerings similar present in the market. And what happens? Margins are squeezed, right? The firm, the company is forced to offer additional services, to bundle with different offerings, right? All activities intended to recover lost margins, right? These three phases can explain the evolution of most companies, can explain the evolution of most industries. And while they vary across companies and industries, what we know from studying the past is that most companies have spent the majority of their time in scale-up and maturity phases. Echoing what Alan said just a minute ago, most companies, right, have spent 10, 20, 30 years creating an organizational model, right, that is optimized for scale-up and maturity. Structures and culture that are intended to take a product and squeeze it for all it's worth, right? And so we talk about businesses being transformed by digitalization. We talk about digitalization as being disruptive, right? And forcing us to adapt. And so how can we explain this using this concept of the S-curve? If we look at these three phases, right? Which one of these do you think is being affected most by digitalization, right? Think about that for just a moment, but I think the answer is fairly straightforward, right? Of course, all three will be affected without doubt, but in particular, the two phases of scale up and maturity, right? It's scale up and maturity that essentially are going to become shorter, right? There will be less time to take a particular new idea and distribute it to the market, and then eventually make money out of it, right? As a result of these phases becoming shorter, this entire S-curve will shrink and gradually flatten. What's worse, if we project this idea into the future, right? Organizations are going to move from a paradigm of a long S-curve with pronounced scale-up and maturity phases to multiple short flat S-curves that replace each other in quick succession, as you see here on the graph, right? The change in paradigm means that the core competencies that essentially gave a firm its competitive advantages will have a shorter half-life, right? A shorter useful lifespan. In other words, the competitive advantage that any firm enjoys because of this change will become more transient. And therefore, the need arises for organizations and within them, the individuals, to develop capabilities, competencies on a continuous, ongoing basis. So my question to you, as we move from a paradigm of a long elongated S-curve to a paradigm of multiple S-curves overlapping each other, is this something that you see happening in your industries? In other words, do you feel that the useful lifespan of your company's core competencies is in fact becoming shorter? Do you feel that your competitive advantage is eroding as a result of the changing context? And for this, we'd like to launch a quick poll, get your opinion, and then comment on that.
All right, folks, the poll is up. Let's go for 15, 20 seconds here. See how many people we can get voting. We just hit the 50% mark. Keep going, folks. 75% mark. Keep going. 5 more seconds. Nice, we're 85. Okay, 1 more person, 2 more, get us, and we'll call an end to the poll. Nice, very good. So there we go. Pepe, what do you think?
I'm trying to figure out how I see it, if I got to take down my slides or what, but what do you see? You comment, Alan. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So what we have is, it's really interesting. So 0% said never, and it's exactly 2/3 sometimes and 1/3 always. So it's really interesting to see. And of course, the thing, I guess, that my only question would be, I would expect it to be 2/3 always and 1/3 sometimes, meaning we know when you think about the lifespan of a company's core competency, it looks like about 1/3 of the people agree with your prior slide that showed how S-curves are flattening. They're getting smaller and sort of faster where you hit the maturity level at the top of an S-curve, and organizations are going more. So I'm kind of interested in how that could be. Maybe if anybody put, sometimes I would love for you to put a comment in the question box. Don't ask us. You could ask a question. I would love for anybody to ask questions, but I'm curious if any of you that voted with sometimes or always, if you could type a sentence into the question box that might be a comment on what you were thinking. I would love to, if anybody puts any in, read a couple of those off. So if you have your question box, you can ask a question or type in your answer why you picked what you picked. So
no, and as they do that, one thing I will say, it does vary across industries, right? And there's a difference in speed with which this phenomenon is occurring, and it has to do obviously with different factors, amongst which the extent to which you can translate a product or a service to a digital equivalent. So for example, the newspaper industry, right, equally translatable to the digital equivalent, and therefore the core competencies and their shelf life vary across industries. But what is certain is that all practices are evolving, and with it, the underlying capabilities that made us a living in the past are also eroding, and new ones are replacing them. And just as an example of this, this is a bit of a provocative side, but look at the top 5 companies by capex, in the 2000s and today, right? A dramatic shift. Now, most companies refer to shifts as disruption. Most boards refers to changes in terms of their competitive capabilities as disruption, right? What they're talking about is not disruption in the sense of Christensen's theory, meaning a smaller firm overtaking me, eating my lunch. What they're actually expressing with the term disruption, I think, is a fear that their core competencies, what got them here, will not get them there, will not make them a living tomorrow. And so, you know, the idea of developing new capabilities, right? If organizational capabilities, in fact, the capacity to perform a particular activity, is essentially the idea of learning. How do we develop capability? It's through learning. And it's for this reason that learning, in my opinion, becomes the premise, you know, the foundation for sustainability and for you know, of competitive advantage, right? You know, for an organization to be sustainable in the future, it has to develop an ability to adapt, to learn continuously, to develop organizational capabilities on an ongoing basis. And that shifts dramatically the conversation in terms of what learning is and its role, from a function that produces moments of learning to an actual ongoing activity that is embedded in the way work happens in the organization.
Can I pause there,
Please, absolutely.
Pepe? Yeah, just from our poll question, I just thought it was interesting. I'm just going to read a couple of these off really quickly, and then see if you have a comment. So here's one about the speed of change from a competency perspective, is from Robin. We create controls for equipment, so some of the products have longer lives in the manufacturing area. So I think that's kind of interesting about product life cycles in manufacturing might be longer. But Dean says, I feel the technology of the energy industry is constantly being reinvented, so the competencies that go with those technologies are always outdated and evolving. So that sounds like it's going real fast. Jacqueline, and I'll just give you a last one here and cut back to you. Technology is continually changing, and the speed is starting to ramp up as more handheld technology is becoming available to customers. So it sounds like a couple of about speed and change. And then we have a question here from Melanie. What practices have you seen for embedding learning in the day-to-day work of the organization and or team? So let's stop and just any comment on the on those three comments about speed of competency obsolescence.
No, absolutely. And look, I live in a so as I said, the speed of change and its impact varies by industry. And you know, I'm the first to say, hey, I live in an industry, education, that is probably of the slowest, you know, in the lot to actually change. And even here, clearly, the impact on capabilities is already starting to be felt in terms of new ways of teaching, new ways of learning, right? You know, if you're in the media business, I mean, forget about it, right? You're running a sprint today, just trying to evolve with the pace of change and with it those capabilities. And then there's industry obviously in between, right? Heavy machinery, like some industrial manufacturing, whatnot. So it really depends, and there's a good work by a colleague here, Evgeny Kaganer, which I can share with the group later, around what are the determinants for that speed. In terms of the practices, that's what we're going to turn to next. So
yep.
we'll
okay. So Melanie,
at the, yeah,
we're going to come right up to that section, and if we don't get your question answered for our good friend Melanie, we'll circle back to you.
Absolutely. So that was the why. Let's turn a little bit to the what. Again, the why probably is not new to you. The what's not going to be new to you. I think we need a new definition of learning. Meaning, if we think of learning as the activity that develops organizational capability on an ongoing basis, then we cannot think of learning as we have to this day. How have we thought of learning to this day? Well, all, I'm going to be a little bit provocative here and ask you to, for a moment, think about learning in your workplace, right? So if this is the group of colleagues that surrounds you or something like this lot, you know, if you were to ask them, how would you describe learning? Or even simpler, paint me a picture of a moment that you were learning. What picture would they paint? What description would they provide? And yeah, there's variances, and sure, some people are not of this nature, but by and large, I would bet that if we're honest, many of our colleagues would paint a picture that looks something like this. This is an ESEC classroom. What does learning of this kind look like? Well, first of all, it happens at a moment in time. Literally, you can point to a day in your calendar that you were learning. Second, it happens at a place. This is a classroom, could be a virtual classroom, right? But there is actually a space, typically outside of my workspace, that I was learning in. And thirdly, it is facilitated, right? There's here, in this case, a professor at the front, whether, leading a debate or providing materials, right, is a facilitated experience. A colleague and I, Evgeny Kaganer, proposed a few years ago now a term that we coined as Omni learning. As a new type of learning that we need to adopt that is more conducive to the ongoing development of capabilities, right? Omni learning is learning not at a point in time, not in a particular place, and not led by a specific person, right? It's learning that happens across time, happens in many spaces, in different configurations, right? And it allows for the ongoing development of capability. Three characteristics we use to describe Omni learning, which I just want to go into very briefly here. We talked about being continuous, we talked about being self-driven, and we talked about being traceable, right? So first of all, continuous. Learning that is continuous is learning that happens across moments that are embedded in everyday life, right? So if you think of a particular learning goal, right, there's an activity associated with that goal that could take place in the context of every day, of every week, of every quarter, or even once a year. And this number of activities varies, right? These activities that we referred to as learning moments are embedded in every day life, right? The second characteristic, of Omni learning is that it's self-driven, right? The self-driven learner thinks of these moments as opportunities. Opportunities for what? For reflecting, for drawing conclusions, for practicing, right? They're learning moments precisely because they're intentionally part of a process of learning through experience that is driven by the learner, right? Day-to-day situations that are used to develop new capabilities. And so this is true. We need the third characteristics, which is this idea of traceability, right? Because if we're going to learn through experience, right, and use that information as the basis for reflection, then we really have to remember the details of what happened. And that's really, really hard, right? We go through these learning moments, they're spread across time, spread across space, and we need some way to capture them, right? So that we can recall the detail and the detail of what happened and really understand why that moment was important, right? And so converting these moments into data is essential, and that's something that digital can help us with. And so this form of learning, Omni learning, which today is typically described as lifelong learning, right? Learning that does not happen again at a place and time in particular configuration and facilitate, but rather learning that is in the hands of the individual, that happens across moments that are embedded in everyday life, that is driven by data. This type of learning we felt is the learning that will enable individuals and then organizations in which these individuals reside to actually fulfill this promise of ongoing capability development, right? You know, and so my second question for you is this one. If you're honest with yourself, and you can answer either as an HR professional or answer on behalf of your colleagues, you know, what mindset would most people say they have when they think of their learning today? Is it this omni learning, this lifelong learning mindset, or is it rather the mindset that I had, or perhaps some of you had, of learning as we experienced it, rather, let's say, you know, traditional learning, right? And so if you can launch that poll, you know, to what extent is omni learning the mindset with which employees approach learning today in your organization?
All right, here we go. We're past 25%. Keep this thing open for 15, 20 seconds, past the 50% mark. Keep going, folks. While we're still voting, Robert says it's just-in-time learning, commenting on that piece. We're over the 80. Let's go 5 seconds. 5 seconds to get your final vote in. And we'll go ahead and close the poll. Thank you all. And there we go. So Pepe, can you see the results?
No, because I think I have to change screens. Anyway, just tell me. What
all
are
right.
they?
Well, I can.
Or you comment.
I'll get them for you.
Yeah.
Yep. So the question is, to what extent is Omni learning the mindset that in the way people approach learning? So always is 6%. Sometimes 81, and never is 13. So so this thing skews heavily to sometimes. So it's basically, we have twin tails on this curve. So always is very small and never is small, which tells me that people are thinking. My sense would be that when I say sometimes at 80%, that means there's a lot of awareness for a new model of learning, like one in which you're describing, omni learning, continuous learning. So how people are talking about, but they're not. It's not the default behavior. It's not the default habit of the organization. So to me, if we think about the world is evolving in a maturity. Think about an S-curve of moving from learning the way it was done for the prior century or millennia to the way it is done today. I think we're still early in the curve to digital learning. I think that's why sometimes is there.
Yeah, no, and I would agree. And you know, there's good research just out by Degreed, and I think it's Harvard Business Review or Harvard Business Publishing, polling individuals in terms of their mindset with respect to learning. And there's an indication coming from that research that there is an appetite, as you're saying, or an increasing awareness with respect to the need to approach learning in this way. But there's a lack, if you will, of infrastructure. And I'm not talking only about technology. I'm talking also about guidance, about you know, metrics, and so on and so forth, as to how to do so. Right. And so while people are increasingly anxious, if you will, about their skill set and the ability and the necessity to develop it, they're equally, you know, in need of and demanding, yearning for a mechanism, an easy mechanism to do so. And so that kind of brings me on to the next question, right? Do mindsets come first, or do the organizations that we need precede them, right? And it's a bit of a chicken and egg, right? Do we build an organization that attracts you know, omni learners or lifelong learners in a day in which perhaps this mindset is not yet pervasive, or do we wait for the mindset to be pervasive and then adapt to it? I think the former is better. I think if you know, if we are forward-looking HR professionals, and beyond that, if we are forward-looking members of the C-suite, we need to create organizations that are magnets for omni learners, magnets for lifelong learners. Whether or not this is the pervasive mentality or the pervasive mindset of the workforce today. And so that brings me on to the how and the question that Melanie asked, how do we do this, right? Because Omni learning, lifelong learning, fundamentally is a individual level behavior, an individual level activity, right? The question is how to create an organization of Omni learners, of lifelong learners, right? How do we take that individual level behavior and essentially scale it to thousands or hundreds of thousands, right? And my answer, I don't have a clue. I don't know. I think that blueprint is still to be written. We have blueprints for creating a corporate university, right? Alan, you're one of the authors of such works on how do I build a corporate university, right? And people have been there, done that. If you want to do so, you take out the books and you fundamentally have a way of assessing a number of different points and creating a learning function in your company. How to create an organization that learns is not so easy. There's work, yes, by Peter Senge that Alan referred to, but perhaps today the idea around an organization that learns is slightly different. Perhaps today the need and also the opportunities around an organization that learn, in part enabled by technology, are different. So the blueprint is, or the way of doing so is still to be defined. But I think we can observe some companies, leading edge companies that are doing some things and start to try to extract some ideas from what's working for them. And one such company is Microsoft. I don't know how many of you have been following the renaissance of this company, right? A company that only less than a decade ago was considered to be sort of falling into essentially falling into a trap of irrelevance, right? Being out innovated by its peers, no longer capable of attracting talent. And thanks to the stewardship of this man's Satya Nadella, has essentially turned around, and is now again one of the world's most aspired to companies in terms of where to work. And Satya, when taking over in 2014, he understood one thing. And one thing that we referred to earlier, and that essentially he describes in this article, right, when he claims that the C in CEO stands for culture. He understood that in the area in which we live, in the area of continuous rapid change, right, it's no longer good enough to work on the business model alone, right? Beyond the business model, a company must develop the capability and the infrastructure to cope with constant change, right? And that goes back to what we referred to before, the organizational model, right? That allows an organization to constantly evolve with its context, to constantly develop new capabilities, right? And in that sense, digital transformation is over not when an organization has evolved its business model, but rather when it's created an organizational model supported by the right systems that is capable of developing new capabilities on an ongoing basis. And so Satya recognizes that his chief job as CEO is to curate this culture, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what an organizational model is: shared beliefs and ways of doing things. And he describes this in a book, Hit Refresh, which, if you haven't read, is a fascinating read. And I think there's three aspects that we can, learn from his work, from the work of three drivers from the work of Microsoft, that start to answer Michelle's question in terms of, what are the practices, what are the solutions, right? If I kind of want to move down this road of creating an organization that learn. So I just want to touch on these real briefly, and I'll make a disclaimer. This is very wet paint still, And secondly, it's not a prescriptive model, right? I don't want to, let's say, argue that all companies should follow these three principles. But again, it's lessons from a leader, and there's others like Microsoft that is experimenting around this concept of an organization that learns. So the first thing is vision. What do we as a company believe is the role learning should have in our company? And vision takes on many forms. First, it's let's say described through discourse, right? And so Satay in 2014, realized that his company is in need of a new vision, and he describes it with this beautiful, catchy phrase, going from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls, right? The clarity, the tangibility, the inspiration of this vision is clearly compelling. And underneath it is this belief based in Carol Dweck's growth mindset work that a fixed mindset limits your growth while a growth mindset propels you and your organization forward. So there's an element of aspirational discourse that is required in terms of crafting a space for learning in your company, right? And it's not learning, again, of the L&D sort of program kind. It's learning of the organizational sustainability, driver of organizational sustainability kind. The second thing that Satay does is he puts in place an extraordinary team of executives, C-level executives, from Jill Nichols, who's his chief of staff, to Peggy Johnson, previously at Qualcomm, who's his head of business development. Kathleen Hogan Key, she came from Oracle, the chief people officer, and others like Kurt Dilbein, who's worked with Obama, and is his chief strategy. He considers these people his culture cabinet. And their primary role is that of being storytellers, right? They go around the organization telling stories of how to move from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls, of how to, let's say, embrace growth mindset behaviors. The third aspect of vision I will mention, and we can take as a learning from Nadella, has to do with role modeling, right? So he has the discourse, he has the stewardship, but then it's his own role modeling which is extraordinary. And there's a moment that stands out in 2016. I don't know if any of you are in the IT industry or remember this moment. Microsoft launches a bot on Twitter, Tay. And basically the idea was very simple. This bot should learn how people communicate and basically and interact with humans on Twitter, interact with Twitter accounts as if it were human, right? Anyway, it turns out Tay got a lot more human than expected, and basically it started spewing racist and profane comments at Twitter users, right? And this was a big project at Microsoft, years of development. And what was remarkable about it is Satay's sort of response, right? He didn't go out and fire the folks. He didn't go out and reprimand them. Rather, he engaged them and personally coached them through a new phase of experimentation, a new phase of innovation that essentially over the subsequent 2 years brought Microsoft to release a new bot, right? He saw failure as basically as a hypothesis testing, right? And the actual testing as the real pursuit. So when you think about vision, thinking about discourse, thinking about stewardship, thinking about role modeling, I think are interesting lessons to take from Microsoft. The second aspect is, what I call practices. And so, the role of learning is important. That's described by the vision, but actually the practices, meaning the learning moments, the work embedded learning moments that are part of day-to-day life are what set organizations apart. And so what do we mean by learning oriented practices or learning moments? What are these things, right? First of all, moments that embed reflection. right? So a practice, a moment is a learning moment if it allows people to articulate limitations and essentially to overcome them, right? The second characteristic, they drive improvement, right? We as an organization need to know what the capabilities that we would like to develop are, and we need to give people space to experiment with these new capabilities, to drive new ways of working as part of their day-to-day job. And finally, this has to be systemic. It's not restricted to the top 100 or the high potentials or whatnot, right? We need to involve everyone across the organization and not kind of the lucky few. So taking some inspiration from work by Degreed, right? If you think of these practices as learning moments in reality, you know, typically our approach has been to, again, think of learning moments as those led by L&D, right? Coaching, e-learning, instructor-led classes, conferences, trade shows, etc. In recent times, we've added kind of self-directed moments, right? The ones that are kind of under the radar, and we've been intent at surfacing these. There's technology that, like Degreed, like Fuse, that are surfacing self-directed learning moments for web searches, from articles, videos, books, moments that individuals engage with their learning, right? That are not L&D driven. I think we need to add a third category, which are routines, right? The routines of everyday life, whether it's the daily check-in with an individual, the team meeting, the networking that you do on a monthly basis, the performance review, the routines that are embedded in day-to-day work life that, if scripted as learning routines, can actually allow for the organization to develop new capabilities. And so some of these routines will be, big and glamorous and sort of wow. And here's an example from Microsoft, sorry. They launched a hackathon, a 1-week hackathon, right? A new routine, annual. Essentially, any employee can now pitch a business idea with societal merit, recruit a team, and they go away and spend a week hacking that idea, right? Fantastic, right? It's a big moment. It's a wow moment. It's very visible. But others are not as visible and yet equally impactful, right? Microsoft did a lot of work on their leadership principles, right? They reduced, complex frameworks of competencies, behavior, skills to 3 basic concepts. But that wasn't what was interesting. What was more interesting about Microsoft was actually how they then provided managers like this one that you see at the Asian Leadership Conference with scripts about how to describe these concepts, but also scripts about actual moments in day-to-day life in which people could practice these concepts. And it's these scripts that then became embedded across the organization in day-to-day routines, right? So that's the second aspect of practices, and I'll finish with the third one of scorecard, right? At the end of the day, unfortunately or fortunately, people do what they're measured for. So we need to have a set of metrics that is actually aligned with this goal of developing an organization that learns. What's wrong with our current metrics? Many of them are output focused, right? We have developed organizations that, as I said earlier, and Alan stressed in his introduction, are orientated, are optimized for scale and maturity, right? The metrics of these organizations are output focused. We need to develop metrics that are learning orientated, that are not focused on the output, but actually on how we develop, how we get there, right? And so, one example of this that is the most obvious, that I'm sure you are all struggling with and working through, is what's happening with performance management, right? This is a colleague from Penn, Peter Capelli, who taught me and Alan, authored a fascinating article on the performance management revolution. But and I'm sure all of you have been questioning yourself around the approach to performance management. What's behind this? It's what Peter highlights in the smaller title, right? A shift from accountability to learning, right? A shift in metrics from output to actually process, right? To how we get there. And again, lessons from Microsoft, right? Satay in this article describes an evolution of Microsoft to a kinder organization, replacing feedback with perspectives. Microsoft, I don't know if we have any Microsoft employees, had a pretty brutal, performance management system, a kind of rank and yank, it's been described, where either, no matter how your performance, you were 10% was always rated as poor, right? A completely new performance management system was put in place, designed more to feel like coaching, to encourage professional growth, right? But most importantly, to assess people not only on how well they performed, but also on how they engaged with their peers. And this is the fundamental shift, not only on were they meeting their goals, but also how they were doing it, right? How were they leveraging input and ideas from teammates? How was their contribution impacting the success of others, right? This change in metric from output to learning is essential. And it's not just about performance management. There's many ways you can do this. Again, another example from Microsoft, talent management, is another opportunity to change metrics, right? A typical talent program, right, is to identify a pool of future leaders, zero in on key traits, and look for those people that have those characteristics, so you guide them into leadership roles, right? This narrowly focuses on a group. Microsoft launched a new talent program, right, not kicking out the previous one that it had on high potentials, but supplementing it with something called talent talks. And essentially, what is it about? The CEO and the senior team meet for once a year for something that takes almost a week to complete, and they essentially review their employees more holistically and discuss, which individuals can we move up or across teams, what skills can we augment, what experiences can we provide, to look at the idea of building talent more broadly. Again, a revisiting of metrics to focus not only on does an individual have or meet a certain criteria, but rather what is the opportunity to continue the development of that individual in other contexts. So anyway, in conclusion, 3 ideas. First, the why, right? This idea of the S-curve. It's not about digitalization and it's linked to particular technologies, mobile, social, and so on and so forth. It's about digitalization and what it's doing to organizations and organizational capability. And this shift in paradigm from long S-curves, in which we took something from startup and had a long time to milk it through scale up and maturity, to short, flat, overlapping S-curves, in which we're constantly required to develop new capabilities and leverage them over a shorter period of time. This forcing learning into a spotlight as the practice of developing organizational capability, right? The second idea, if that's true, Omni learning or lifelong learning or whatever label you want to call it, learning that is not in a place and time facilitated, but rather learning that is in the hands of the individual across time and driven, of course, by data, right? We cannot, as L&D professionals, develop the learning fast enough to evolve our workforces, right? We need to put this onus into on hand. We need to therefore facilitate individuals' engagement in learning that happens in the context of day-to-day work through a set of practices and routines. And finally, the third idea, the how, building a learning culture, right? Easy said, hard to do. I think on this one, the verdict is still out. What is the blueprint? I don't know. Ideas from Microsoft, vision, Think about the role of learning in a company. How can you verbalize that? Who are the stewards? What is the role modeling? Think about the practices, but not just L&D led moments and not just self led learning, but also routines. You know, the way people meet, the team meetings, the way performance management is carried out, the way I do daily check-ins with individuals. And finally, the scorecard. What are the metrics that we have in place? Are they all output focused? Do we have metrics that measure how we get there and not just if we do? These three ideas can help, I think, move us towards a culture that is typical of an organization that learns. And with that, we'll stop and take questions for a few minutes, insults, whatever you want.
Questions, insults. All right, folks, we have time. Probably you can squeeze in one question. The one thing I would add is Pepe and I are kindred spirits in leading a learning organization renaissance. If you're interested in joining us, shoot me an email. But we're really looking at organizational learning, getting people to shared vision, building learning culture, a flourishing environment, creating a place. I think your presentation today does a beautiful job of framing out, Pepe, a framework for consideration, a framework for working on. But as you said, this is wet paint. We're working on it. We need people, daring people, bold people that want to help write the playbook for the future of organizational learning. So the quick question coming in on as a learning leader, how do you engage senior leaders or get a senior leader champion?
Yeah, it's key. I know this is the typical thing, right? Oh, we need the CEO on board. Well, I'm sorry, we do. But I am seeing more and more CEOs be open to the idea of digitalization and its effect on organizational capabilities, and therefore that being leading to learning than ever in the past. You know, in the past we had to ask for a seat at the table for learning, right? And the reasons for doing so were varied, right? Hey, we need to keep our workforce happy. Hey, we need to be good citizens and have this as part of our employee proposition. Today, it's not about that. Today, it's about survival, organizational survival. And so if you ask a CEO, can you hire people fast enough? You can't. Can you ask a CEO, can we buy technology fast enough? Well, you can buy it, but if people can't use it, you got a problem, right? So the only way that you can actually meet the challenge of keeping up with continuous fast change is to develop individuals that have a learning attitude, to attract these individuals so that they can actually outpace you and your provision of direction.
Yep, beautiful. So that I think you're making the case that the learning curve is getting steeper and change curve is getting faster, and people have to build a learning culture in order to climb that, shape that curve, and stay one step ahead of the competition. And that is not a learning leader's job. That is every leader's job. And I think the learning leader, probably many of the folks on this call, we need to be the champions of senior leaders to get them to help think about and drive continuous learning as a mindset that's baked into the fabric of the enterprise. It's baked into the culture. It's baked into the environment, the systems, and the processes, and support systems all reinforce that. So, Pepe,
Alan, I would
reinforce
reinforce just one before we leave what you just said. I think it's very important to also be humble and realize that this is not an L&D job. This is not a learning leader job, but we can be the catalyst. What you just said, Alan, is absolutely critical, right? This is actually a C-suite job. We need the IT person, like we do the CEO, like we do the marketing and communications folks, right? To develop this culture is not an L&D job. It's not constrained to the L&D function, but we can absolutely bring it to the table. We can be the advocates and we can provide the spark. And that's what happened in the case of Microsoft, right? The CEO is there, but Kathleen, the CHRO, is specifically recruited to actually be the facilitator of that C-suite that is making this happen.
Yep, that's a beautiful example. So anybody on here, shoot me an email if you want to join our mission, our learning organization Renaissance, we have an ever-growing list of chief learning officer types where we're engaging CEOs of very large organizations that are becoming the champions of organizational learning and building a learning culture. Pepe, thank you so much for joining us. It is now 6 o'clock your time in Barcelona, Spain, so enjoy the rest of your evening. Everyone else, thank you for your time. We appreciate it, and this will be made available for everybody within 24 hours on the CorpU blog. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.